So on that note, let's go ahead and move forward 2 slides to get just to our second quiz question. Yeah, so here, oh, actually, I think that was two slides too many. So yeah, well, we could. So this was a question that was inspired by our state climate proposal that was released a few weeks ago, noting that ferries are the largest consumers of diesel in Washington state. And electrifying ferries will provide significant carbon savings. That is a great thing. But we also wanted to highlight how many 7-day Seattle to Alaska cruises will be the equivalent carbon emissions as would be carbon savings from electrifying one ferry. So if we could jump forward to the next slide. That answer is about 3 to 4 cruises. Each 7-day cruise is emitting approximately 5,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. And so just 3 7-day cruises is basically canceling out that electrification of one ferry, because cruise ships, they emit a lot of carbon. And so we'll have David Kipnis tell us a little bit more about that in a few moments. But first, well, actually, I'll just go hand it over to him.
Hello, everybody. My name is David. Go by he, him, they pronouns. So wonderful to see almost 35 of you here tonight. Thank you so much for attending. We're going to break out into some rooms where we can get to know each other a little bit, an opportunity to say hello. And a couple things we thought you could bring to the breakout rooms. You could tell a little bit about yourself, and maybe starting with what brought you to this meeting tonight. Is there something specifically that you had in mind about a concern, or were you just wanting education? Go ahead and share that with the group. Also, if there was one change that you would bring to the maritime industry that you think would have a great impact, let's talk about that in the breakout rooms as well. Then we had some information on the couple of slides, the questionnaire slides. So that's also information in which we can discuss in the 5 minutes of breakout room time that you'll be given. Let's be mindful of your time of speaking. Make sure that everybody has a chance to put their input. And I guess we'll go ahead and kneel, and we'll go ahead and go into the breakout rooms. There'll be about 3 people in each breakout room. You should be getting a prompt here in a minute from our engineer, Neil. And then you'll just click on that prompt and enter a breakout room.
I think we're all back from our breakout rooms. And I think we can go to the next slide. And David is going to talk to us some more about cruise ships. David, you're still on mute.
Yeah, so when I think about, the cruise industry, and I have had the opportunity to see these huge boats on the water, they can look pretty small from far away. But when they're docked into our piers at Pier 66 or Pier 91 at the harbors here, as you move closer to them, you get a sense of how large they really are. And as you get a sense of how large they really are, you also get a sense of the potential impact, negative environmental impact that they can create. And this image here was created to sort of begin to sort of visualize that impact, a comparison between the size of the Space Needle and a typical cruise ship that comes here into Seattle. And Seattle attracts some of the larger ships for a couple of reasons. And one of the main reasons is that it has such deep waters. So the ships can get in pretty easily. And as if you look out at the Sailor Sea, the entrance into Seattle is pretty large too. So it can accommodate pretty easily these ships coming in here, even though we have a large shipping industry too. It can accommodate all of that. In fact, it gets some of the largest cruise industry ships, mega ships with 6,000 passengers, and the slightly smaller ones with 3,000 passengers. Those are the type of ships that we get here in this area. We're going to be taking a lot of data from 2019 because that was kind of a more typical year for the cruise industry. Obviously, it was impacted by the coronavirus in 2020. So just in 2019, there were 200 and more than 200 cruise ship calls here into Seattle, serving over 5,000 passengers. And as mentioned earlier, go ahead and put questions in the chat if you have any. Next slide, please, Neil. Another reason why Seattle is popular for the cruise industry is there's a federal law that requires cruise ships to visit one international port. And since we're so close to Alaska, since we're so close to Canada, they can count Victoria and Vancouver as an international port. And that is another reason why so many cruise ships come here. And there are two places that they mostly dock, Pier 91 and Pier 66. One of the nice things about Pier 91 is that they use shore power. And shore power is when ships get to plug into electrical grid, they don't have to run their auxiliary engines while at berth. And we were just talking about the scale of these ships and what it takes to keep the services running while they're in port. The things like their swimming pools, their saunas, the restaurants, all the other services which they cater to for tourism need to keep going. A lot of people never even get off the ships. And so they have to keep those services running. Without a shore power connection, the carbon emissions on each cruise ship is equivalent of one average size car driving to and from Seattle to New York 30 times. So shore power is a significant factor in mitigating the environmental damage. Right now, Seattle, as I mentioned earlier, has one of its harbors which provides that service. The other one is scheduled to provide it in 2023. And interesting enough, a lot of the leases with the cruise industry really sort of suggest using shore power when it's kind of convenient. It's not really mandated. So we'd like to certainly see that increased. Next slide, please. So one of the big considerations when thinking about the cruise industry is its impact on local economies. And a lot of big corporations. As activists, I think we spend a lot of time fact checking these big corporations. For example, the cruise industry might say, actually, tourists are there's over 1 million people that will come to Seattle for tourism, when the fact is they're counting them both as they come on and off. So really, we take a look at it and say, really, there's only 500 people. And obviously, the big difference is when you double that, counting them when they come on and off, and you multiply that by the dollars that they might spend, the number looks like a huge economic benefit. And we really question that. In fact, a lot of the tours which the industry sets up, a lot of the local businesses don't get all of that money. What is the average commission that a cruise ship holds back for themselves when making deals with the local businesses and tour operators? So how much of that money goes to the local businesses? Switch to the next slide, please. And the fact is, I'm sorry, I moved a little bit too quickly. So 50% of those contracts, the money goes to the cruise industry, not the local businesses. Next slide, please. We feel at Seattle Cruise Control that Small coastal communities are impacted by a far greater amount. For example, if you take the town of Skagway, Alaska, a town typically a little bit over 1,000 people, and this image here shows the huge impact that cruise industry has on that town, not only environmentally, but also by amount of people. Suddenly, you have a ship of 3,000 or maybe 6,000 people pulling into a town of Skagway that usually only has to accommodate for 1,000 people. So now you start multiplying the use of water, the use of the streets, all the services that a town needs to provide for residents now need to scale up to try and accommodate the cruise industry. That's a very difficult task for a town as small as Skagway to provide the financial resources to scale up. The cruise industry really has no obligation to provide additional income for those communities to scale up. Skagway, for example, potential cruise visitors yearly in a cruise season. So the scale up is 7 times what their normal population is. Next slide, please.
David, are you moving your mic around?
Not intentionally.
It does cut you out sometimes.
Thanks for letting me know, Brad. Miranda, would you please join in from here?
Thanks. Yeah, so picking up on that thread of impacts to coastal communities, this is very much an environmental justice issue, disproportionately affecting areas near ports, near port activities such as the Duwamish Valley. The tool used here to create this map showing that disproportionate impact was developed in part by Front and Centered, a coalition of communities of color-led groups across the state who work on intersecting issues of equity, environmental, and climate justice. And I find it really helpful to pair with this Puget Sound Clean Air Agency statistic that nearly a quarter of the diesel exhaust in the Puget Sound region does come from the maritime sector, but that impact isn't spread out evenly. Here in Seattle, our shipping activity is really concentrated where the Elliott Bay meets the Duwamish River. And so that area and further south, which is home to more communities of color and people with lower incomes, suffers disproportionately from the environmental health effects to water, air, and climate. Next slide, please. The air pollution is also a maritime worker health and safety issue. Air quality on cruise ship decks is worse than the air in the most polluted cities in the world. And cargo ships aren't really any better because they're burning the same types of fuel on the same types of engines. And when you also include diesel exhaust from cargo handling equipment, idling trucks, the air around ports is just frankly hazardous most of the time. And one of the biggest immediate health hazards to that is ultrafine particles from the diesel exhaust, which is linked to asthma, other respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases. It becomes quite significant. Maritime work also is risky in other ways. The CDC shows that fatality rate 4.7 times higher than just sort of an average. Some of this is due to commonalities in industry, such as heat stress, cold stress, the use of power tools, and some of it is very specific to the maritime environment. Not just things like vessel disasters and water immersion or severe weather, but living and working in restricted spaces for an extended period of time, isolation away from home and family. And I'd like to stress, a dangerous profession is not synonymous with worker exploitation. I do not mean to imply that all maritime workers are exploited, but the reality is that when you're out at sea, you're isolated, you're away from people, and it can be hard to get back home, as COVID is really helping bring to light the risk of exploitation is higher. Next slide, please. So this question comes from a very recent UN report called Crew Changes, a Humanitarian Safety and Economic Crisis. So as of December 2020, how many seafarers were stranded aboard commercial vessels due to difficulty with repatriation? Meaning that they're not able to travel back to their home countries because of COVID travel restrictions. And to give you some context for that, the seafarer workforce globally is about 1.5 million people. So next slide. Yeah, so of a 1.5 million workforce, 400,000 people are estimated to be on cruise ships and cargo ships, unable to get back home. Many be, outside of their contracts, not getting paid, living with a lot of uncertainty. And while some of this might seem outside of the bounds of what is primarily a climate-focused group, the issues are interrelated. And as all problem solving starts with awareness, we felt that talking about the maritime industry, we needed to bring this to light as well. Next slide, please. Touching a little bit more directly on the climate impacts of global shipping. So this is the 6th highest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. And of course, transporting cargo and goods by ship is much more efficient than transporting it by airplane or cargo. If anyone was on the aviation team's general meeting presentation. That said, it is still just a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. And even as near future technology is expected to make it a little bit greener, that greenhouse gas is still going to rise. Most of these cargo ships are carrying about 1 to 2 million gallons of fuel and going for about 12 days between fueling. And one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this is to just kind of touch back to Governor Inslee's climate proposal and that note that Washington state ferries are the largest consumers of diesel in the state. Our state inventory, which is informed by the federal EPA guidance, uses fuel sold in Washington as a proxy for carbon emissions in the maritime industry. So that works great for a system like our ferry system, where the ferries are owned and operated and buying their fuel in Washington state. But when you have these large ocean-going vessels that can travel for 12 days without refueling and are stopping at ports that are national and international, there's a real question of what might we be missing as part of that carbon inventory. Next slide, please. So also talking about little things of like, what might we be missing when we're thinking about shipping? When we think about ports, we often think about the geographical port. So if I think about shipping activity locally, I think about all of those large cranes down by the stadiums, over at Harbor Island, and I think, oh, that's the Port of Seattle, except that's not the Port of Seattle. Well, it kind of is the Port of Seattle. It is the Northwest Seaport Alliance North Harbor. So if you are keeping up on cargo business happenings just for personal interest, or you're doing research on financials or the air emissions related to shipping, you really have to know that Port of Seattle is primarily cruise business. Port of Tacoma exists on paper, but I think only had about 132 vessel calls total in 2016. And where all the shipping activity is really happening is the Northwest Seaport Alliance. And their North Harbor is Seattle, their South Harbor is Tacoma. So next slide, please. And looking at how is all of this affecting our marine life, that's way too big of a question for us to fit just on 3 slides. But as a general overview, the really big picture, how is climate change impacting our waters? And I'd really like to thank the Nature Conservancy of Washington for creating this really regionally specific infographic, which shows that the impacts of climate change, warming our waters, acidifying our waters, are really going to the base of our food chain. The little critters, the guys that are trying to make shells that are then feeding our more iconic species like our salmon and our octopuses and our orcas. We're also seeing lower oxygen levels. So habitat for native species is shrinking and changing. And as the waters are warming up, we're also seeing more toxic algae blooms, which can sicken anything that eats algae or anything that eats things that eat algae, which is, fish, birds, marine mammals, and people. Next slide, please. There's also the impacts from the ships and what happens on the ship. So people, we create trash and we create, we poop and create sewage, and all of that has to go somewhere. And when you're really far away from shore, the reality is a lot of what happens on a ship then goes into the ocean. Locally, fortunately, we have some protections such as the no discharge zone. So you can no longer put raw sewage directly into near coastal Washington state waters. That's nice. Cruise ships, which can be carrying 5,000 to 6,000 people, have some special memorandum of understanding with the Department of Ecology and the ports. But one of the things I'd like to highlight in this is open loop scrubbers, because they're not really included in the no discharge zone or with the cruise ship MOUs. And if the term open loop scrubber isn't familiar, it's a piece of technology that basically gets put onto the funnels of ships to try and get out air pollution, primarily sulfur. And so what they do is they suck in seawater, they spray it over the exhaust, and then dump it right back overboard, usually without treatment. And for those of you that remember your chemistry, sulfur and water together is acidic. And our last slide just demonstrated acidity is a problem for our local marine ecosystem. Some areas of the country and the world have banned the use of open loop scrubbers. Our regional ports are taking a wait and see approach. And both 350 Seattle Maritime and Seattle Cruise Control recently signed on to a letter urging the Department of Ecology and the Port of Seattle to update the cruise ship memorandum of understanding to ban the discharge of scrubber exhaust or sludges. That's not really something that would impact the shipping industry. So there's some unexplored territory that might be ripe for some future work. And I also just want to give a little content warning about the next slide. It contains a really graphic image of a dead orca whale. So if that's not something that you want to see, take measures so that you don't have to take a look at that. Next slide, please. So one of the other really big risks is the ships themselves. This is an 18-year-old male southern resident orca known as J34, who stranded near British Columbia in December of 2016. The postmortem suggests that he died from trauma consistent with a vessel strike. As the NOAA quote shows, vessel strikes are one of the primary threats to our large marine mammals. A recent 10-year study also showed that orca deaths are more directly related to human activity than previously believed, including vessel strikes, the noise pollution, category 3 marine diesel engines are incredibly noisy. And the deeper the water is, the farther that noise travels. And that noise interferes with orcas' ability to talk to one another, to forage through echolocation. And when salmon are already scarce, that really increases the impact. And the good news is something as simple as just slowing ships down can help with both of these issues. And that's something that Stacy will talk about a bit more later on. Next slide, please. So after thinking about so many of the things that can go wrong or can have dire, if not unintended consequences, we want to think about what to do. And often when we think about what to do, we think, well, what can the ports do? So we wanted to give an overview of how our state ports work, what they can do, what they can't do, to help just give everyone a bit of a framework for when you're thinking about solutions. Thinking, is this a port solution, or is this maybe action that might happen elsewhere? So one of the first things you might note about this map is you don't need water to have a port. We've got 75 ports in the state in 33 of our 39 counties, and some of them are pretty far from water. Washington state law says that port districts can be about seaports and marinas, or they could be airports, railroads, industrial parks, and sometimes also tourism. Our state law basically sets ports up to be a very specialized form of government. So you might note regionally, sometimes the city of Seattle and the Port of Seattle are on the same page, and sometimes they're at opposite sides of the table. And the Port of Seattle can't make the city do anything, and the city can't make the port do anything because they're separate governments. And so they have to learn to work things out together. We are also the only state where our port commissioners are elected. I don't know if you guys knew that, but we are unique in that. The ability to elect commissioners that are aligned with the needs and the values of the communities that they're serving in is something that is unique and special. And as we go into a year that has port commissioner elections, I think it's also important to highlight that even the port commissioners who are most aligned with values of, say, environmental justice, climate stability, are still going to be constrained by what Washington law says ports can do. And what Washington law says ports can do is promote economic growth, promote trade, promote industry, promote tourism. So as long as that's what state law says that ports can do, we will probably continue getting proposals from our port commissioners to expand airports, to expand cargo terminals, to expand cruise terminals, et cetera, because that's sort of how the system is designed to work. Next slide, please. So a helpful way to think about what can ports do, how do ports operate, is to think about them as landlords, because that is their primary action. They use they lease public lands to private entities, so they can set lease terms, they can make fees, they can enter into commercial arrangements. But what they don't have the ability to do is regulate things. So a port can't create a rule that, say, would apply to all ships. That would be something that would happen by a different type of government. That said, even though they can't create the rules, that doesn't mean they're powerless, because they can lobby, provided they're lobbying for things that the state says they can, which is economic growth, trade, industry, and tourism. And also, as landlords, it's important to note that ports aren't accountable for the carbon emissions created by their tenants. So another shout out to the aviation team. They sent around an email the other day noting that in today's commissioner meeting, they were bringing up the Northwest Ports Clean Air Strategy, the Port of Seattle's Climate Action and Air Plan, and the Port of Seattle's vision of no greenhouse gases by 2050. And it's important to point out that that vision doesn't mean that all planes and ships and cargo equipment will be zero carbon by 2050, because the planes, ships, and cargo equipment belong to tenants, not the port itself. Next slide, please. So if the ports aren't regulating things, where does that happen? It's a good question to ask because ports and port-related industries are often exempt from a lot of different rules and regulations. A lot of that happens at the federal level. So this session, there's a really exciting bill called the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, which has the potential to have some action around. One of the things that this would do would establish a greenhouse gas monitoring and reporting system for the shipping industry, which would be a step towards creating a framework for decarbonization. Also setting up a federal quiet seas and clean skies program. And so that's something to keep an eye on. And last year, Representative Jayapal signed on to the Cruise Integrity Act. It was a messaging bill, so it wasn't really expected to pass. What it did do was tell the cruise industry that if they were going to try and pursue COVID relief funds, they were going to have to do some tax, environmental, and labor reform. And the result of that is the cruise industry decided not to try and receive any funds, unfortunately. The other questions that this team is interested in is, will updates to the Growth Management Act apply to port districts? It's an open question that the ports themselves are discussing. And the same with HEAL Act apply to port districts. Hopefully the answer is yes. But there's that concern that if the answers are not yes, could ports become safe harbors for polluters that are not able to operate elsewhere? So that's something we really want to keep an eye on. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Stacy to talk about solutions and ways to plug in.
Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, so although we know that we can't just keep up business as usual and be able to also make the changes we need for climate, the good news is that there is actually a lot of solutions that are available right now that could be implemented that make actually a pretty good, start to make a pretty good dent in the problem while we are waiting for the solutions that will be able to get us potentially off of fossil fuels for the things that we need to do, and also to maybe start rethinking the way that we do things. One of those solutions that's available now is just slow steaming, which, as Miranda started to discuss earlier, is literally just slowing down. So this, in essence, doesn't cost any new equipment. It's just a choice to make. And so when you reduce the ship's speed by about 20%, you can cut down the ship's air and carbon emissions by as much as about 25%, just by slowing down. And so then, with some of the other impacts that we've talked about earlier, there's going to be benefits in those areas to slowing down as well. So again, that's less marine noise, so that pollution that's threatening our orcas and other whales. And also it's going to minimize those risks of having the ship strikes. Next slide, please. Another solution that's available right now, so it would incur a little bit of materials, but not anything near, say, outfitting entire fleets of new ships per se. And that's basically using some non-new technology, which is just put a sail on it. And it's amazing how much putting a sail on something, adding it to existing ships, can make a difference. With retrofitting existing ships with kite sails, and that's going to give the wind assistance propulsion, it can decrease fuel use by an average of 10%. But sometimes it can be, more considerable than that. Although 10% isn't something to just throw out the window either. That is actually a huge footprint to be able to cut out 10% by something so simple. As you incorporate wind assistance technologies like sails, rotors, kites, suction wings into new ship builds, this can reduce the ship emissions by up to 60%, which is definitely not a small portion. And, which makes it all the more ridiculous to hear companies and ports still talking about converting ships to LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, which, if you're not familiar with that, is a fossil fuel. So clearly not a solution we can keep around. and we shouldn't be investing any new money in fossil fuel technology of any kind. Next slide, please. Another type of solutions versus things that say you can actually do physically with those ships is, again, rethinking the way that we're using these vessels. And so we're thinking, having those discussions, bringing these things into these agencies, decision making, how and where are goods produced and consumed? What do our supply chains look like? How can we reduce demand? Something that I think a lot of people, that's usually in our audience, is something on our minds. But how do we, versus singularly necessarily as people even, how are we going to collectively reduce our demand? Another thing is, how do we build resilience into our systems? We're seeing with COVID that, there'll be moments where we can't do business as usual, and what are we going to do? And the more resilient our systems, the less this is going to have huge impacts on our lives when we have these different, natural disaster and disease type of moments. And another thing that is really important is to, again, be having those conversations about what does a just transition look like. And when we say that, that's a just transition for so many different areas. That's a just transition for workers that would be potentially affected by doing things like changing the supply lines and the demand, and by looking at how do we actually repair and heal some of the damage that we've already caused, and what does worker equity look like in those industries to deal with some of those issues like Miranda was talking about, like things like being stuck on ships. And then changing the constraints that the ports operate under. So that's going back to, no matter how great the people are in the positions, we have to remember that the systems that we have, the laws that we have in place now, are to uphold the systems that we have. So if we want new systems, we're going to have to figure out kind of some new policies to go with those. Next slide, please. And just kind of another thought to go through as we think through, like, could we just replace, let's change one magical fuel for another, but keep doing things the way that we're doing? Probably not going to be able to happen. And just kind of one little fun thing to look at here as you're thinking about that is, how many ships and how many crew would it take to replace the cargo ships with just sailing ships? And right now there's about 50,000 merchant cargo ships and about 1.5 million crew members worldwide. But if we wanted to turn all of that into sailing ships, we would need 169 million sailing ships and about 2.5 billion crew. So you're looking at a huge increase. So, we need to be really looking at holistic solutions where we're not picking one piece of a problem and fixing one thing at a time, but actually creating different ways of doing things. Next slide, please. And another next slide, please. And there we go. And another kind of solution that's really important too is thinking through solutions around the habitat that's around us and the ocean health. And one of those things that is really starting to get a little more attention and potentially some funding on the horizon is going to be blue carbon. And when people say that, part of what you're talking about is just natural species, native plants that really help to hold in that carbon. The same way that forests are going to hold in carbon, you're going to find different things in the ocean are going to help hold in our carbon too, and help get that carbon actually like deep down and hold it there for a long time. And so that's things like oysters, kelp, eelgrass, and things near the shore habitat. It's going to be things that are going to do so many things at once. It's going to store the carbon. It's going to be food support for our food web. It creates a natural breakwater, so you're having a little less impact from from the waves. Especially, something else to think about really large ships is that you're having really large wakes, so you're actually potentially doing more damage to your shoreline the bigger the ships that you decide to welcome into your port. And another important piece of as we uplift native species, what we're also doing is help protect the cultural value for a lot of our Northwest tribes and local communities. Because there's just, the being able to protect and restore what naturally should be here doing its job and interacting in this web is just extremely important, and in more ways than those physical ways we can count, like say storing the carbon. And there's also a potential to reduce that ocean acidification. And let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So we've been telling you lots of fun information. Now, I bet you're asking, how do I help? So this is that fun portion, and we'll tell you how you can help. And so if you're thinking maybe you might want to kind of be part of the maritime team, there's a few kind of team objectives that some of us have thought through to help guide you in seeing what we might be working on. We don't necessarily have specific campaigns already lined up, dive into this action right now. We would like to build that together as a team. And so some of the things that we hope to do is to uplift the voices of the most impacted by the Maritime's current ways of doing business. We'd like to try and help shift the narratives around business as usual to help create some new solutions and some different ideas to help change that business as usual. Because if we don't present the solutions, it's really hard for people to leave one thing when there's not a new destination in sight. And so as we do that, we'd like to be creating opportunities and support for equitable and just economy. So weaving that as a foundation into the decisions we make, the campaigns we look into, the connections we build. We want to integrate ocean health into the climate work. And again, we want to aim for this work to lead to deep systemic and policy changes. Next slide, please. So if you are interested in kind of helping out in more of the team, in the team manner versus, just kind of, I'll do a little action here, a little action there, mostly came to learn. If you want to plug in, there's quite a bit of different ways to do that. There's a lot of research that goes into creating and looking for solutions. We want to be building partnerships and relationships, again, throughout the area, especially around, again, places where the most effects from these maritime industries are happening, so that we know what we want to, so that we can go ahead and uplift versus narrate. And social media support is always really important, especially now when so much is online. So we're looking for all different ways to help with social media. And then also help developing campaigns and actions. So like I said, we are just building this team together right now. And this is an opportunity to show up to planning sessions, help drive the work, and help, determine messaging and all kinds of different aspects of the team. And if you are interested in joining the team, one way to do that is to just send me an email. It's up on the screen and we can drop it in the chat, but it's just stacy@350seattle.org. So just send me an email if you do want to plug in to a research project or kind of get plugged into the team in a specific way. And next slide, please. Another way to get plugged in, and we'll drop some links for all these things into the chat. Another way to get plugged in is that we're going to have that for our first team planning session on Tuesday, February 2nd at 6 p.m. And so in that session versus something like this where we've been doing a lot of kind of overview, this will be where we're actually kind of building our team together. And another thing that's really easy to do and take action, and again, you don't have to necessarily feel like you're joining a work team. If you're I just kind of want to help a little bit, is kind of where you're at. There is public comment at Port Commission meetings. And the ones here in Seattle happen twice a month. And we can also drop into the chat where you can find instructions on how to do that. And really with that, I just want to stress that you do not need to be an expert in any of this. All you have to do is comment from the heart about why anything that we've talked about tonight or anything else within this realm is just really great when they hear from new people. It really makes a difference versus the same folks talking to them all the time. So even if that's all the only way you can help, it is super helpful. And I'm also happy, feel free to email me if you need help putting together what you do want to say. And another way to help is kind of supporting social media. So along with 350 Seattle's socials, you can also follow Seattle Cruise Control on both Twitter and Facebook. And that's going to deal mostly with cruise issues, but also just in general with maritime fuels and kind of some other things that really is maritime industry wide. And that is kind of some of the ways that we have for jumping in right now. So I think what we'd hope to do with any time that we have left is to just hang out and take some questions and